Today, we're privileged to speak with Michael Del Rosso, who is an expert on election security, cybersecurity. Michael, could you introduce yourself to give our viewers a little bit of your background?
Well, actually, I'm a fellow at the American Strategy Group, which is Bill Bennett, Brian Kennedy, myself. It used to be Angelo Codavia before he passed away. And ASG is a pure play focus on existential threats to the United States. There's all sorts of other things that you could be looking at from a political science point of view. We just look at existential threats. And I do have an extensive background. I was the chief technology officer at three large technology companies. And I did quite a bit, a stint doing nothing but fundamental design work for over 20 years when I was an engineer, and then longer when I was actually running big engineering groups. And that includes, operating system internals, writing operating systems from scratch, and building and designing and building every manner of information security product,
Right.
firewalls, intrusion detection systems, et cetera. I also did DARPA research on back in the 90s that is now what is in use. It was called a Global Command and Control Systems Leading Its Services. So it's a global grid
Okay.
with all sorts of security on it. So I mean, I have quite an extensive background in this.
And
Though I didn't know if that's what you wanted to talk about.
oh
Because
no, yeah, we're talking about the election, and you
Sure.
were involved in the attempt to stop the steal in 2020, right? And
That's correct. Yeah.
what role did you play there?
Well, it was actually preceded it. I mean, if you go back to even before Trump was elected, we knew that the government was completely corrupted. Okay. In fact, I ran for Congress in 2016, and that's why the Republicans came after me, because they're as corrupt as the Democrats. What people were commonly referred to as the deep state is really quite a bipartisan organization.
Right. And so what part of what I've been discovering in my journey learning about our elections is that the rhinos, the anti-Trump Republicans, are just as invested in keeping our elections hackable and stealable as the Democrats are, because they'd rather lose the election to a Democrat than let a MAGA Republican win. Would you say that's
Yeah, there's no way the Republican establishment wants Kerry Lake as a senator.
right?
So
Right.
you see there's quite a bit of chicanery going on in Arizona right now.
Yeah, we definitely,
But
definitely want to talk.
but if you want to fast forward into 2020, so we were tracking essentially, it's the correct term is not deep state, it's a counter state, which is a term Mao coined from a tactic called the long march into the institutions, where you literally get hired into the government as a communist revolutionary, and you have to actually know how to do the job. So if I wanted to subvert global public health to achieve communist revolutionary objectives, I would go to medical school and then get hired into the government like Anthony Fauci did,
Right.
you know, and or Bill Ayers, let's take over the teachers' colleges, that kind of thing, right?
You know, it's interesting. A lot of people don't realize Anthony Fauci was recruited by Dick Cheney. The Blaze has documented this. After the anthrax attacks, he panicked and said the U.S. needs to revive its bioweapons program. A lot of that was illegal in the United States. He found Fauci, set up the programs to create viruses like COVID. And when it turned out it was illegal in America, they started doing it in China. So Dick Cheney's fingerprints are all over.
Yeah, and in fact, another tell, there was something called the WMD Commission that published its findings in December 2008. And at the time, I was actually just winding down service on the Congressional Committee to assess the threat of high altitude electromagnetic pulse. And the WMD Commission said, oh, there's all these WMD threats, but we think it's going to be a biological. So that was in December 2008, setting the tone, which is when you see the timeline, you go, oh, but they've already been working on this in the government to make that happen.
Right.
And this is like, let me go fast forward to Rand Paul. I'm sure he's a nice enough guy, but my problem with Rand Paul was he kept on haranguing Fauci that he was going to prosecute him for perjury. He fundraised off it to the point that Fauci even showed his emailers saying he's fundraising off me. Well, that's all well and true, but when you look at the history, because we got Fauci's emails from a FOIA request within a year or so after, he funded the genetic engineering of a bioweapon, gave it to the communist Chinese. Now, whether China had it released from Wuhan by accident or deliberately doesn't matter, because their behavior was to treat it as though it was deliberate. They lied about it, went right into the mid-January trade agreement signature ceremony at the White House, lying about it. They bought up personal protective gear globally, shipped it back to China. So
they stopped internal flights from Wuhan, but allowed people from Wuhan to keep flying around the rest of the world.
That's why Milan was such a hot center, because the Chinese had already bought up all the big fashion industry companies in Milan. So there's actually nonstops from Wuhan to Milan, and then you had an epicenter in Italy around Milan breakout. So Fauci is guilty of treason in a time of war, and from his emails, so he conspired to cover up the fact that it was really engineered, and he and his colleagues pushed for it to be zootic. They censored.
Remember bats? We were all joking about bat soup.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And who doesn't like a good bat soup from the wet market? But this wasn't it.
Right. So then you were involved in the attempt to stop the steal in 2020, right?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say we saw what was happening in 2019. So I was working with Rich Higgins, and we actually published a warning in 2019 that in 2020 you'll see nationwide violence oriented on race to disrupt the election.
Wow.
I wrote 2 memos for Rich that he gave to Kash Patel that were never acted upon. They were basically precise instructions for designating BLM and Antifa as foreign terrorist organizations.
Right.
Because I had worked on legislation in the Hill to force the issue with the Muslim Brotherhood. So all of this, when everything transpired with the virus preceding the violence that started with George Floyd, we instantly started publishing things and also sending them to the National Security Council that said, look, there's a pathogen, SARS-CoV-2. Yeah, there's a disease, COVID-19. But what you're seeing the government do is a Marxist mass line narrative. That's the COVID Marxist mass line narrative, meaning they did things that were not scientifically sound and lacked even logic, but their objectives were to achieve revolutionary objectives of destroying liberty and really disrupting the election.
And let me give evidence for that. While they were locking school children at home and not letting them attend classes, blue state governors were dumping COVID patients, the one place they would kill people, nursing homes. Tens of thousands of Korean War veterans, grandmothers died.
It's democide, the death of a people by their own government.
I call it the blue state nursing home genocide. I was writing about it at the time.
Yeah. Well,
and I think they did it to keep the death statistics high enough so they could justify mail-in balloting and steal the 2020 election.
Well, and also they already had in the works the mRNA gene therapies, and the only way they can get an emergency use authorization, it needs to be deadly, and there needs to be no therapies.
Which is why they wouldn't allow ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, because those were alternative therapies. So they wouldn't have been able to force the vaccine into our arms. All of this is background. And so you and I and David Clements and Emerald Robinson, we were all really afraid they were going to steal this recent presidential election. I want to ask you, did they try and fail? I've heard rumors about white hat hackers in the Pentagon who actually prevented a steal. That there's some rumors about that. People are talking about Alfie Evans, whose home was raided by the DOD police agency the day after the election. Or did they decide not to steal it? Why didn't the mechanism, which is currently stealing down ballot races like Kari Lake's in Arizona, why didn't they steal the presidential election, in your opinion?
Well, there's a lot. First of all, there's a lot of disinformation out there, right? So in 2020, we were actually, like I said, we were sending this to the National Security Council, right? We were actually tracking a lot of the fraud that they were going to do. So all the Zuckerbucks and the massive potential for millions of mail-in ballots, we were tracking as being absolute things that needed to be investigated. And we also tracked the provenance of Dominion and Smartmatic. Mm-hmm. And the guy that was point on that was a very well-respected CIA case officer and former head of station, Gary Benson. And now I'm trying to remember the name. It was, So if you go to stolenolectionfacts.com, so he put this out 2 weeks before this election. So we had assets that were connected to South American government diplomatic services and intelligence services that were friendly, that had told us a lot of stuff. And long story short, there was sufficient evidence to meet a legal predicate that there was hostile foreign interference in the election by 2020. Gary got funding and continued doing this investigation, having to fly all over the world, to literally have to go into banks in foreign countries to find ownership papers that were never online. And so what he published is there's a book coming out, I guess January 6th. I guess they're trying to circumvent. Not only he put it out this late because he didn't want to disrupt the election, but he's told some people on our side. So you can't do anything because the federal government's corrupt, right? So right now, until it's reclaimed, you can't do anything. But what was a sufficient predicate to do an extraordinary investigation that never happened in 2020 is now evidence that's sufficient for a conviction.
Wow.
So is my understanding. So I don't want to get sued by Smartmatic or Dominion, but it's my understanding that these claims are being made that now that evidence is there. And so when you look at the way Fox rolled over, what was the $700 million settlement or whatever with the Dominion lawsuit?
But I've seen people suggest that they never really paid it.
They got China to back a loan. Who knows what they did? But the point was, people have to understand the mainstream media has been gaslighting you for decades, especially since 2020. So when people go, well, that's not provable. Well, yeah, it is, because you're not looking. So Chad Wolf and Chris Krebs never looked.
Right.
And in fact, not only did they never look, it came out from congressional investigations. He had a couple 100-man plunge team censoring everything about the election. That was reasonable concerns. The federal government was censoring people of safe, inexpensive, effective therapeutics that would have cured COVID quickly. In fact, Peter McCullough, and there's a lot of sound bites from him. One of his testimonies was that he thinks that 95% of the hospitalizations and hence the deaths should never have occurred if you had done prophylactic measures like zinc, quercetin, vitamin D levels, and then actually treated them. So basically,
Dr. McCullough is my cardiologist, and when I got COVID, I went to him and he gave me his regimen, and I followed it. He's been stripped of his board certification in cardiology, where he is a pioneer. He was kicked out of the practice he founded at Baylor University. They're trying to drive him out of the practice of medicine for saving lives during COVID and telling the truth. So we're seeing how the totalitarian information works.
The entire medical community has destroyed patient confidence in it at this point, because they were so subverted by money. So I was listening to a guy. He's an expert on mind control. You go, oh, with this some exotic MK Ultra thing? And he goes, no. He goes, there's a lot of ways to do mind control. The easiest one for physicians. So you got a guy, he's making $500,000 a year, but he's working for a large hospital corporation. He would never know how to put a shingle up and run a business. So when his livelihood gets threatened, guess what? You're controlling what he's going to do.
Right.
And so you had people, if we just diagnose someone with COVID, because we're trying to, with really excessively high amplified polymerase chain reaction PCR testing, you get $13,000. If you put someone on a ventilator, you get $39,000. I was looking at some stat that the average COVID death resulted in in Virginia. It was vary state by state, but in Virginia it was about $210,000 of government incentives once the person died. So these are absolutely perverse incentives. You know, the pencil pushers that run the hospital corporations want that money, and they immediately just stepped in line with it, like the censors at the social media companies stepped in line. So basically, Donald Trump was interviewed 3 months ago by Sean Ryan, and he used three very specific words: stolen, coup, and communist. He said the 2020 election was stolen. It was a coup, quote unquote. He said that Kamala and Waltz are communist. Okay, we agree with all that. So basically, this is what I have a problem with no Republican wanting to put a fine point on it. The Constitution was overthrown by Marxist revolutionaries in 2020. Right now, we see Oh, all of a sudden there's 17 million Democratic presidential votes that don't exist in 2024, 2016, 2012, or
Right.
2008,
Where did
but
they
they
come
were
from?
in 2020, you know.
Where are those? And during the COVID lockdowns, we had with a candidate, Joe Biden, who never left his basement. We had a 16 million vote surge out of nowhere. That is the best evidence of
Well,
election
and
fraud
as
that
Brian
we've
Kennedy
seen.
pointed out, he wrote a great piece, I think in the American Mind or American Greatness published it, but he pointed out, he goes, so China can print perfect, undistinguishable $100 bills from the real stuff. They've collected data from everywhere, from your bank records to your signature card to your DNA on hundreds of millions of Americans. They have warehouse and infrastructure all across the country. So if they can do all of that, what's to stop them from printing a perfect ballot that actually has your perfect signature on it?
So let
You
me
know,
ask
so
you,
so
so
so,
with
so
all
any of
that,
these things are possible, but they did. Go ahead.
why didn't they do it this time with the presidential race?
All right, so I'm not going to answer that because I don't want to speculate, and there's some very good theories. I don't even want to go into them, but the fact is, at the
You
end of the
think that, do
day,
you think the steal was prevented, or do you think they decided not to do it?
they decided not to do it. I think and I won't go into why, but the point is that these are literally homicidal, diabolical communists, and there's hostile foreign connections to all of them. There's from any estimate like 70 or 80 members of Congress that are hardcore communists, right? The interaction with China and Russia, and this is out of the scope of this conversation, but the best evidence is that there were the sign from my evidence and people that I've talked to, like Soviet defectors on this topic, is the Sino-Soviet rift of the 1960s was a massive trovka, which is a Soviet term that we have no counterpart in, of a strategic all of nation deception. And for sure, the Soviet Union never collapsed in 91. It reorganized as part of a strategic deception to disarm the United States that was crushing it under Reagan. And in fact, that's really heavily documented. I'll send you, I have maybe, I summarized it in about 10 pages, double spaced.
You have anything online people could read if they want to?
No, actually, I don't. I mean, I read an occasional article. My own concern, all I ever wanted to do was just mind my own life. But I've been really focused on this for almost 20 years now, having been involved going back 45 years. But I literally walked away from Silicon Valley just before entering the peak of my career to focus on the existential threats to the United States, because we were about to lose it. As I would say in like 2005, I go, by 2020, it'll be unreclaimable if we don't try to do something now. And people that have known me, that know I put my money where my mouth was, and that's all I've been doing for 15 plus years, almost 20 years, and that's where we are now. But the fact is, though, there's everything is deception. And now the stream is a Christian site, right? So it's okay to talk theologically here.
Absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
if you look at the two biggest threats going on in America are both that there's spiritual warfare and political warfare, and the average person is unaware of both realms.
Right.
You know, Al Pacino in The Devil's Advocate, where he played Satan, he goes, the best thing I ever did was to get people to think I didn't exist, right? And likewise, the same goes for political warfare. And there's a hallmark is controlled opposition in all of those arenas too. So you have right now a political warfare operation that no one's aware of. In fact, Rich Higgins, who your publisher, Calamo Press, published his book, The Memo. And it's a little 7-page memo. You can find it online. And he said, look, there's a political warfare operation that's Marxist. It's foreign and domestic enemies. They're looking to destroy your presidency. This is in May of 2017. You need to immediately stand up a political warfare operation in the White House to run offensive and defensive political warfare operations. Now, this has nothing to do with politics. The name political warfare is just the term of the tactics of of using every kind of dirty trick you could imagine, from targeted assassinations, but
lawfare, massive lawfare,
law for everything, right?
like
And so,
Rudy Giuliani.
and it's real war. People die in it, and entire nations lose their liberty. And look at Venezuela. That was all done with political warfare.
Right.
So
Brazil.
we're under attack, and when you take an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, you become a professional. Even if you're a 17-year-old Marine private, when you took that oath, and as such, you need to be able to identify all enemies, foreign and domestic, and you need to identify their tactics. So the fact that, in fact, in unrestricted warfare, a 1999 War College thesis by two Chinese colonels, they were full colonels at the time, they both retired as major generals. In that, I want to say it's on page 102, they said that the United States is especially susceptible to political warfare because their attention to it is so atrophied in their defense infrastructure. So they even say this is like should be our focus of main effort, and it has been for 100 years.
So, like, bringing it to the present, right now, the Democrats are trying to steal House seats. They're trying to steal Senate seats. The rhinos are trying to get Thune or Cornyn as majority leader, who hate Trump, who hate the January 6th defendants. What can we do as Americans and as Christians to battle against these people?
Well, the first thing is prayer, because the biggest threat we face as Americans is that we're leaderless. And I mean that literally. So there's not a single member of the House or Senate that understands the political warfare that literally dissolved the presidency out from underneath Donald Trump's feet in his first term and stole the 2020 election. And I love President Trump. I'm a massive supporter of his. I wish him well. He needs to implement what Rich Higgins recommended in May of 2017. So Emerald Robinson just tweeted last week. He goes, so who's going to man the political warfare desk at the White House? Because that's where you're being attacked. It's as though in 1942, you're a Navy admiral. I say, hey, make sure all these convoys get to Great Britain, okay? But you don't know what a submarine is.
Yeah.
You're gonna have a lot of wet sailors in the water. Okay?
There's a big learning curve.
And that's how bad it is now. The focus of main effort, their primary tactic is political warfare, and you're not even looking at it. So that spiritual scales on the eyes. Prayer is the only thing that'll get past it. And I would say anybody that has access to the president, they need to sit him down and say, will you please rewrite this memo that was directed toward you, that you let Rich get fired and Perp walked out of the NSC when all he was trying to do was to save you. And at this point, it's to save his life. For goodness sake, they tried to kill the man twice already, at least that we know of.
Yeah.
President Trump. They're not going to stop. And so when they say we're not going to let President Trump get installed, they mean it. Now, and let me give you an idea. So the left spends billions of dollars on Marxist revolutionary activities in the United States that are literally acts of war. And the right, these billionaires on the right with their tight pockets, they wouldn't give a nickel to try to address that or even to analyze it. So you have the Transition Integrity Project in 2016. It started in the fall of 2015 and concluded in June of 2016 with John Podesta. They had a big war game, and it's all published. You can find it. They said, our plan is to not concede. Our plan is to start setting the information space that you're going to see a red wave from a blue wave from mail-in ballots. And you may think Trump won election night, but that's not going to happen.
So that all happened in 2020. And
it happened exactly like they said. Now you got Jamie Raskin going, oh no, we're going to go to civil war, literally, and we're going to need bodyguards, literally. There's that famous clip of him a couple of months ago. But the Transit and Integrity Project, they put together 175 DNC governors and members of Congress, and they war game this whole thing. They're war gaming a plan for the sedition and overthrow of the duly elected government.
Well, they did it.
And so, I mean, that used to be crimes in the U.S. Code.
Do you think that they're going to try something like that again this time, or
there's probably a half a dozen mechanisms that they can actually still disrupt everything because Trump is not president. And then even when he gets to be president, there's nothing reassuring that says he learned from 2016 to 2020 what happened to him. Because if he did, him and his entire entourage would have never shut up about the fact that the election got stolen. And I don't know. I contacted a bunch of prominent ministers. I won't name them, but in the whole circle of where your publisher and everything is. And this was after maybe the 15th of January of 2021. So before the January 20th installment of the regime, but it was after the January 6th steal. And I said, look, you guys had these 3 million people praying in September. You had the Jericho March in December on the Supreme Court, 1 million people praying. You did all these things except actually identify the root cause of what an enemy was doing to overthrow us. And you had all this, if you will say, idolatry that this guy's going to save you and you can't beat us, instead of relying on God. And I recommended in this email to the number of these guys that had been involved in organizing these things, I said, you need to put together immediately a massive prayer march of repentance to God that you lost one of his most precious gifts to us, that of liberty, and do it on May 1st, on May Day, the day of international communist solidarity, based on the founding of the Illuminati in 1776. That's how that date is stuck in the Marxist time frame. It's from the 19th century on. And we still need to do that. It was still, in fact, I'd like to see, have your guy write a piece up, but that's take credit for it. It's that simple. We need 1 million prayer warriors in DC, go to the National Cathedral, go anywhere. This is not political, praying for God to forgive us for letting communists overthrow the country, and we did nothing about it. Wow. In 2020, the left would have caused nationwide riots again. When those riots died down at the end of April, George Floyd was an obscure felon who killed himself with a fentanyl overdose, and the commies were in place to go leverage that into nationwide riots and shaming of everything that's valuable in America.
And they could turn it on and off like a water faucet.
Yeah. And so there's a massive underground movement. There's a massive guerrilla movement. Plus, in the ensuing 4 years, that because no GOP stood up to the steal on January 6th, right now you let Marxist revolutionaries spend trillions of US dollars for all sorts of nefarious purposes. Amongst them is opening the borders up. Right. And we find out that last year alone, 350,000 people were just flown in directly, illegally, from foreign countries. So you have some estimates put it as high as 20 million illegals. They brought every kind of woe. They brought diseases. They brought 100 cartels from 50 new countries. They're stressing the economic support systems for with a cloud pivot strategy. They have the potential for massive election fraud. But the most serious thing they did was they masked an invasion army of actual soldiers that are on the U.S. soil. So every time they say, well, there's all these military males by the hundreds every day, military-age males with no women or children with them, and they're coming from hostile nations on valid government identification papers that have compulsory military services, many of them. They're not draft dodgers. They're literally soldiers in foreign armies that are being brought in and distributed throughout the country in civilian garb. Now, people might go, well, that's crazy. No, there's massively strong evidence. So we have sources in different intelligence organizations that are friendly to us. In Central and South American governments, the diplomatic corps, their intelligence services. Even I have friends in the Ukrainian government intelligence services that they don't want Putin nor the Davos crowd, and they actually monitor the Mexican border. They know what's coming across here. So you might have a 500,000 man army distributed across the country at their disposal. That didn't exist 4 years ago, and they were ready to take it to the streets then.
If Trump actually tries mass deportation, that army might be activated. Listen, we're running out of time. So to learn more about this, you'd recommend people read the book The Memo by Rich Higgins?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would follow Emerald Robinson's Substack is another important piece. She's got a bunch of people with diverse national security backgrounds publishing on her Project Sentinel Substack. on these exact issues. That's where I got a lot of my information from, reading them, and it's very important. But so they're Marxist revolutionaries. They're traitors because they're doing it with hostile foreign governments. As much as Putin wants you to think he's a nice guy, he's not, and he's in bed with Xi. And they're by the thousands in our government right now as a counter state. Look at Herbert Marcuse's book on revolution and from 1972, and he talks about the long marches, the institutions, and a counter state. Saul Alinsky said, if you want to be a real revolutionary, get a haircut, put on a suit, and get a job in government.
Yeah, and so they certainly did. Michael, thank you so much. God bless.
God bless. Bye-bye.